Welcome to the alien dusk, the world of science and fiction. Let's enjoy the journey. The cold steel of the shackles bit into his wrists as he stumbled forward, dragged by creatures whose forms defied natural laws. Tall, silver-skinned beings with elongated limbs and luminescent eyes, they moved with a grace that mocked gravity itself. The air smelled strange, sharp, metallic, and tinged with an ozone burn that made his throat ache. Around him, the walls pulsed, living veins of unknown materials weaving in and out of crystalline surfaces. Each step echoed across a vast corridor where alien banners floated without wind, etched with symbols that shifted when he dared stare too long. Somewhere deep in his gut, fear coiled like a living thing, but he forced himself to walk tall, even as his legs trembled. He was human. That still meant something, even here. The procession drew the attention of others. Pale-faced beings in shimmering robes whispered behind clawed hands. Mechanical constructs, like walking sculptures of glass and bone, turned their empty sockets toward him. He caught fragments of language, guttural clicks and melodic hums, but none meant anything to him. Yet the contempt in their stares needed no translation. Beyond towering archways, a massive chamber loomed ahead. His heart hammered against his ribs. Something ancient, something regal, awaited him there. This was no ordinary capture. He wasn't prey. He was a message. And he was about to be delivered to the very heart of the alien empire itself. She sat atop a throne of living metal, vines of shimmering energy coiling lazily around its spires. Her form was striking, humanoid yet undeniably alien, with skin that shimmered between violet and silver under the pulsing light of the chamber. A crown of translucent crystals hovered above her brow, shifting with her every breath, as if drawn by her very will. Her eyes, twin galaxies of gold and violet, fixed upon the human with a gaze that burned through flesh and bone, searching deeper, peeling back layers of fear, defiance, and confusion. He stood before her, battered but unbowed, and in that single heartbeat, something ancient stirred between them. A murmur rippled through the gathered court, a sound like the hiss of shifting sands. The queen tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Was it curiosity? Disdain? Something more dangerous? He could not tell. He held her gaze, refusing to lower his eyes, though his instincts screamed at him to kneel, to beg. But something primal, something stubborn, kept him upright. A flicker of surprise crossed her features, so quick it might have been imagined. Yet it was real enough. In a court where the strong devoured the weak without hesitation, a single fragile human had dared to meet the queen's gaze as an equal. In that moment, two worlds, two species, and two fates collided, and nothing would ever be the same again. The queen rose from her throne, every movement fluid and deliberate, her flowing robes whispering secrets against the ground. A collective intake of breath swept the chamber. To rise was to act. To act was to change everything. She descended the dais without a guard at her side, approaching the human as if he were a puzzle she intended to solve with her own hands. Whispers turned to gasps when she stopped mere steps away from him, the faint hum of her presence prickling against his skin. He expected a blow, a decree of execution. Instead, she reached out, fingertips hovering just above the iron collar that chained him like an animal. An artifact of crude design by their standards. And yet she touched it as if it were a relic of priceless worth. He flinched instinctively, and the queen's lips curved. Not quite a smile, but something dangerously close. She spoke a single word, musical, sharp, utterly alien. He didn't understand it, but he felt its weight, a command, a question, or a challenge. Around them, the court watched in the stunned silence. This was unprecedented. A human, base, primitive, fragile, was not to be treated with such interest. Yet here stood their queen, breaking 1,000 years of tradition with a single outstretched hand. In the chaos of a living empire, amidst endless stars and ancient power, a simple human had become something impossible, a mystery even a queen would risk everything to understand. Beyond the throne chamber's shimmering walls stretched an empire so vast that even light itself bowed under its enormity. The Zirian throne commanded over 1,000 worlds, their banners stitched not with cloth but with living strands of encoded history. Each planet bore the mark of conquest or alliance, a testament to the queen's lineage that traced back to the first civilizations that dared leave their dying sons behind. Their fleets, sharp as blades and silent as the void, prowled the corridors of space. Entire moons were hollowed into war engines, orbiting black holes like predators around wounded prey. Where Zyrian ships passed, silence fell. Where Zyrian armies landed, resistance crumbled like dust before the tide. Yet the empire was more than brute force. It was a tapestry of science and sorcery, where technology bent reality itself, where biological marvels lived in tandem with ancient machines whose makers had long since been forgotten. Cities floated upon the clouds of gas giants, crystal towers spiraling up from frozen oceans, and forests of sentient trees whispered to the stars. At the heart of it all, beating like a cold, merciless engine, was the throne. A relic older than memory, binding its ruler not just in power but in purpose. The queen was both servant and master of a legacy that demanded expansion without end, dominance without mercy. And now into this vast dominion of perfection and terror, a single flawed human had been thrust, and nothing would remain untouched. Power in the Zyrian Empire was not inherited by blood alone. It was earned through ritual, a brutal theater of loyalty and cruelty. From the moment of ascension, a monarch was bound to prove their worth not just to the court, but to the very spirit of the empire itself. Coronations were no mere celebrations. They were battles waged without weapons, contests of wit, strength, and sheer endurance against the elements. Beneath the twin moons of their sacred world, heirs were tested in the ceremonies of ice and blood, where the cold stripped away weakness and pain, sculpted kings and queens into living legends. The queen had survived her trial in silence, clad only in thin layers against the planet's blizzards, her body lashed by the frozen winds while the blood of her rivals steamed upon the ice. She had outlasted a dozen claimants, each test more brutal than the last, until the throne itself acknowledged her by binding her mind to the empire's will. Her scars, though hidden beneath regal garments, were badges of survival that no crown could counterfeit. To show weakness after ascension was unforgivable. To show mercy was death. Royalty ruled not by popularity but by awe, by a terror that gripped their subjects' hearts and forced loyalty from the marrow of their bones. And now, in this world where compassion was seen as the first step toward ruin, the queen's curiosity toward a lone human was more than dangerous. It was heresy. Humanity had become a whisper among the stars, a cautionary tale woven into the cultural memory of 1,000 alien civilizations. Once proud masters of their own blue world, humans had risen fast and burned brighter than any species before them. They had split the atom, conquered disease, reached out into the void, only to fall victim to the oldest flaws they had never managed to outgrow. Wars of greed, pandemics of apathy, self-inflicted scars upon the fragile skin of Earth. In time, the homeworld that had birthed poets, tyrants, and dreamers alike withered under the weight of its children's mistakes. Refugees scattered across the cosmos like sparks from a dying fire. But few survived long among the stars' cold indifference. To the Zirians, humans were myths, stories of chaos given form, harbingers of invention and destruction in equal measure. Some elders spoke of humanity with a grudging respect, recalling their savage ingenuity, their refusal to bow even when outmatched. Others told darker tales of alliances betrayed, of new weapons forged from desperation and fury. Finding a living human now was like unearthing a relic from a forgotten war, a creature more dangerous in spirit than in strength. And within the queen's court, there were those who whispered that harboring such a being was madness itself. For if even a fraction of the legends were true, a human could tear apart empires, not with armies, but with sheer, impossible will. Behind the serene mask of royalty, the queen fought battles no courtier would ever see. Every decision, every gesture, was weighed against the infinite machinery of the throne's expectations. Her life was not her own. It belonged to the empire, to the chain of rulers who had bled and died to keep it unbroken. Doubt once planted was a seed that could grow into ruin. She had been trained to root it out without mercy, in others, in herself. Yet as she stared across the void of species and history at the human standing before her, something uncoiled in her mind, something that refused to be silenced. Curiosity, hope, danger. A part of her remembered the oaths sworn beneath the frozen stars, the promises made in blood to protect the purity of the empire at any cost. Another part, quieter but stronger by the day, whispered questions the throne had forbidden. Could there be strength in understanding instead of conquest? Could there be evolution without annihilation? No ruler reigned forever. She knew that as surely as she knew the beat of her own hearts. But legacy could outlive lifespans. And now, with a single act of interest in a frail, stubborn human, she was setting into motion forces she could not control. The crown upon her head grew heavier with every breath, but the weight in her heart grew heavier still. For the first time, she was not sure she could carry both to the end. The chamber was colder than the corridors had been, a deliberate design meant to sap strength, to strip pride from prisoners, before the first question even fell. Crystalline walls reflected distorted images, fracturing reality until it seemed the human stood among 1,000 versions of himself, none of them whole. At the center of it all, the queen stood without guards, a gesture that spoke volumes to those who understood Zirian culture. Power needed no protection. Power was protection. She spoke, her voice a melodic vibration in the frozen air, the syllables of her tongue curling around concepts his mind strained to comprehend. A translation device had been embedded near his ear without his consent, a parasite of convenience. And now her words trickled into meaning. State your purpose. A command yet layered with something more, something almost curious. He clenched his fist, the shackles digging deeper. He was no ambassador, no soldier of fortune. He was a survivor of circumstance, ripped from a dying earth and cast among the stars like flotsam. Purpose? His very survival was defiance enough. Silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Around them, the courtiers pressed closer, sensing the stakes, savoring the tension. One false step, one sign of weakness, and this interaction would end with blood in the slow fading of a legend. Yet he said nothing. He only met her gaze, refusing to flinch. And somehow, impossibly, the queen smiled, a thing so rare that some in the chamber gasped aloud. This was no ordinary interrogation. This was the opening of something far more dangerous, understanding. The queen circled him with a predator's grace, her presence pressing against the fragile membrane of his mind. He should have felt fear, crushing and absolute. Instead, something else stirred. Not trust, but recognition, as if two notes from opposite ends of the universe had found harmony in dissonance. His heart hammered in his chest in erratic, furious rhythm against the cool, measured cadence of the queen's every step. Yet somehow, against all reason, he felt a tether forming between them, thin as spider silk and just as unbreakable. The court watched in frozen horror, sensing a shift in the air that no decree could undo. Connections between species were rare, dangerous, forbidden even. To feel empathy across genetic chasms was to invite ruin. Yet the queen did not retreat. She studied him as if he were a new constellation, one that might alter the course of destiny if only she dared to chart it. He spoke at last, a simple word, his name. No titles, no embellishments, just a thread of identity thrown across an impossible gulf. The queen absorbed it, her head tilting in a gesture ancient and profound among her kind. Acceptance. Their bond was not born of mutual understanding, nor of respect. It was born of isolation, two sovereign souls adrift in endless currents of duty and survival, finding in each other a reflection too true to ignore. The heartbeat of a queen, the heartbeat of a human, out of sync. Yet somehow, impossibly, they beat together. The queen posed questions crafted with surgical precision, each one a blade meant to carve out the truth of him, his species, his motives, his value. Yet each time he answered not with submission, but with riddles, half-truths, and a stubbornness so infuriating it bordered on reverence. "What drives your kind to resist annihilation?" she asked, her voice a low current beneath the cold air. He shrugged, a gesture so utterly human that it defied the grandeur of the moment. Because we can. Such defiance would have earned disintegration under the gaze of any lesser monarch. Yet the queen merely studied him deeper, as if each act of rebellion only fed her fascination. His insolence was not born of ignorance. It was survival woven into his very bones, a refusal to be anything less than free even when caged. The courtiers fidgeted, exchanging uneasy glances. To them, dominance was the only currency of worth. To see it defied so casually was an abomination, a seed of unrest planted in the marble heart of their traditions. Yet for every wall he built with his words, for every answer that skirted their expectations, the queen did not retreat. She leaned closer, not farther, and in doing so, she committed the most treasonous act a ruler of the Zarian Empire could commit. She listened, and in the unspoken spaces between his defiance and her pride, something ancient and dangerous began to bloom. The possibility of change. The human was a paradox the queen could not unravel with logic alone. He was frail compared to the towering soldiers of her court, yet within him burned a resilience so fierce it scorched the very air around him. Where others saw brokenness, she saw fire. Where others whispered of weakness, she glimpsed unyielding strength. She moved closer until only inches separated them, the light of her crown casting fractured halos across his bruised features. He did not bow. He did not plead. Even now, when death could come with a single gesture, he stood as though he carried the weight of 1,000 fallen worlds upon his shoulders and refused to let them fall again. The queen saw the scars invisible to the courtier's shallow gazes, not on his skin, but on his spirit. Battles fought not with weapons, but with will. Losses endured not because of cowardice, but because no other choice had been left. In him lived a kind of survival the Zarian Empire had long since forgotten. She saw something even more dangerous, potential. The kind of potential that did not just survive empires, it reshaped them. For a brief, forbidden moment, she imagined what it might mean to walk beside such a being, to blend strength with strength, to forge something neither human nor Zarian, but transcendent of both. But then the weight of the throne pressed upon her mind, cold and relentless. She stepped back, the moment severed, but not forgotten. Some weaknesses, she realized, were merely strengths misunderstood. The marble halls of the palace, once symbols of unshakable power, now trembled beneath the weight of whispered treason. Shadows stretched longer, conversations grew quieter, and the ever-watchful eyes of the court sharpened to knives. It began as a murmur, a doubt too dangerous to voice openly, but too tempting to ignore. The queen favors the human. In a culture built on conquest and purity, such favoritism was a crack in the bedrock, a weakness ripe for exploitation. The nobles moved like sharks circling wounded prey. They gathered behind veiled tapestries and within the resonance chambers where sound twisted and faded, forging alliances forged not by loyalty, but by mutual hunger. Hunger for power, hunger for the crown that had begun, at last, to look vulnerable. Rumors wove themselves into the stone, that the queen had spoken privately with the human, that she lingered too long in thought after seeing him, that her judgments grew slower, her will softer. All lies or half-truths, but in the poisoned waters of court politics, even lies bore teeth. The human, unaware of the wildfire his presence had ignited, remained shackled behind walls thicker than a battleship's hull. But no chain could bind the danger he represented. To the court, he was no longer just a curiosity. He was a catalyst, and the first fractures of rebellion began to show. Beneath the grand domes of the judgment hall, the nobles assembled, an audience of silken lies and sharpened smiles. Their robes glittered with jewels mined from forgotten worlds, but their hearts were colder than the void between stars. They spoke in coded language, gestures and glances, never openly daring to accuse the queen of betrayal. Instead, they questioned her judgment, her fitness, her sanity. Had she not spent too long in solitude, burdened by the death of her line's heirs? Was it not a compassion sickness that led her to sympathize with a lesser species? Each word dripped with poisoned respect, each sentence a blade hidden behind protocol. and the queen, seated high above them, heard every dagger as if it pierced her own flesh. The human became a symbol, not of hope, as he might have been in another world, but of decay, of the old empire crumbling under the weight of sentimentality. The jackals of the court smelled blood, and already they began tearing at the edges of her authority. All it would take was one slip, one mistake, and they would devour her. The queen watched them, her face an unreadable mask. She had ruled longer than any of them had drawn breath. She knew the price of sentiment. She knew the cost of hesitation. Yet even as she steeled herself against them, she could not forget the human's defiant eyes, nor the forbidden thought that lingered like a ghost in her mind. What if he was worth it? The ancient laws were clear. No ruler of Zerea could show partiality to an outsider. To care was to contaminate. To love was treason beyond forgiveness. And yet, hidden deep within the queen's heart, the bond had already been forged. Unseen, unspoken, but undeniable. It hummed beneath her skin, a living current, pulsing whenever she thought of him. The high priests, guardians of the empire's brutal traditions, summoned her to the sanctuary of stars. There, beneath mosaics of conquest and blood, they offered her a choice wrapped in ceremony: destroy the human and reaffirm her loyalty to the throne. The queen stood silent while their chants echoed through the sanctum. In their eyes, this was mercy, a necessary purging of infection before rot could claim the empire. But in her eyes, it was a death sentence for something far rarer than loyalty: for hope. The human was not her weakness. He was her mirror, her rebellion against a future where duty demanded the sacrifice of everything that made her soul stir. To sever the bond would be to sever herself. She left the sanctuary without a word, the priest bowing low in false reverence. Behind her, they whispered prophecies of doom, speaking of stars falling and empires dying. And for the first time in her long, storied reign, the queen wondered if they might be right. In the solitude of her private chambers, the queen activated the resonance mirror, its surface swirling into windows of probability. She watched visions of futures, some glorious, most drenched in ruin. In none of them did she see a future where she both kept the human alive and kept her throne. The choice sharpened before her like a blade. Duty demanded sacrifice, but for whom and at what cost? She crafted her plan in silence, knowing that betrayal would come from all sides. Allies would turn, enemies would gather, and still she would stand alone, by choice this time, not by necessity. Summoning her most trusted aide, she issued a single command: see to it that the human is moved. Secretly, safely. The aide hesitated, a flicker of doubt betraying even the most loyal heart. In Zerea, protecting a lesser being was a heresy punishable by annihilation. But orders were orders, and loyalty to the queen was a religion of its own. Preparations unfurled in shadows, secret passageways cleared, false records fabricated, patrol routes diverted. Every heartbeat of risk was another stone added to the avalanche she could no longer outrun. If she succeeded, she would lose her empire. If she failed, she would lose him. In that private, shivering moment, the queen chose love over legacy, a gamble no monarch before her had ever dared make. And somewhere in the darkness of the marble halls, the jackals caught her scent and smiled. Beneath the twin moons of Syria, the royal gardens bloomed with bioluminescent wonders unseen by any human eye. Flora that pulsed with gentle light, vines that whispered when touched by the breeze, and ancient trees older than the queen's empire itself. Here, hidden by twisted roots and flickering shadows, the queen met the human once more. Their meetings had no witnesses, no guards, only the hum of distant stargates thrumming against the bones of the world. She showed him the gardens not as a ruler to a captive, but as a soul starved for connection. Here, secrets were traded like precious relics. Stories of ancient wars, of alien gods that once ruled before her kind, rose to dominance. Wounds, both personal and historic, laid bare in the quiet spaces between them. The human, still shackled but less so in spirit, listened, asked questions, laughed, a rough, warm sound that no Zurian had heard in generations. It was not submission that shone in his gaze, but curiosity. In a world built on silence and fear, he offered something far more dangerous: understanding. Each night they returned, drawn together not by orders, but by an unspoken need that neither dared name. Beneath the endless stars, two souls from shattered worlds began to stitch something fragile and defiant between them. Sitting among silver blossoms that shimmered under the starlight, the humans spoke of Earth, of blue skies stretching over fields of golden wheat, of oceans that breathed like living things, of cities that rose and fell like the tides. He told her of music that made soldiers weep, of paintings that captured moments too fleeting for words, of poets who raged against the dying of the light. The queen, ruler of 1,000 systems, listened as though hearing the pulse of a universe she had forgotten. Her empire measured value in conquest and control. Humanity had measured it in memory, love, and the wild, foolish urge to create beauty, even when surrounded by despair. He spoke of Earth's end, too, not as a tragedy, but as a warning. Humanity's arrogance, their endless hunger, had gnawed at their home until it could no longer sustain them. But even in their final breaths, they fought to remember who they were. "We are not the strongest," he said. "We are not the smartest, but we endure." The queen felt the tremor of that truth rattle the foundations of everything she had been taught. Empires fell, stars burned out. But something in the human spirit, reckless, stubborn, glorious, refused to die. In those stolen hours, he gave her something no one else dared, a reason to hope for something beyond survival. Words became inadequate. They turned to gestures, to shared glances, to the silent conversations of beings whose languages were too small to contain what stirred between them. In the hidden chambers and abandoned corridors of the palace, they created a language all their own. He taught her simple human things: how to laugh without purpose, how to mourn without shame, how to dream without certainty. In return, she taught him the ancient rituals of the Xyrian soul, the silent dances of allegiance, the markings of respect traced on the air with trembling fingers. In a ruined observatory where the stars had long since been mapped and conquered, they moved together like figures from two different songs, trying to find a shared rhythm: clumsy, aching, determined. The queen had never known fragility. The human had never known power. And yet in the quiet spaces between them, they met not as ruler and captive, but as equals. Stripped of titles, stripped of chains, they became simply two lost souls spinning in the endless dark. The court would call it madness if they knew. Her people would call it betrayal. But beneath the silent dome of forgotten stars, it felt like freedom. One night, among the ruins of an old war citadel where the walls still bore the scars of long-dead rebellions, they spoke of futures. The queen, her voice barely a whisper, wondered aloud what it would mean to walk away, to leave behind the suffocating weight of the throne, to disappear into the vastness of the stars with no empire and no expectations. The human, smiling a tired, broken smile, told her it would be the greatest adventure either of them had ever known. Not a conquest, not a war, but a life built piece by piece, day by uncertain day. They dreamed out loud, a hidden world far beyond the reach of the throne, a home forged not from blood and ceremony, but from choice. She imagined fields under alien suns. He imagined children who would carry the stubborn spark of humanity and the ancient strength of Xyria in their veins. For the first time in her memory, the queen realized she wanted something no worship or crown could ever give her. Not power, not victory, but a future. They clung to that fragile hope like castaways clinging to a piece of wreckage. Around them, the empire still roared and raged, blind to the treason blooming quietly in its heart. But for a few precious hours in the ruins of forgotten battles, they allowed themselves to believe that love, reckless, impossible love, could be enough to change the course of worlds. In the stillness of the night, the first cries of rebellion echoed through the crystal skies of Xyria. The stars above, once a symbol of imperial dominance, now seemed to flicker with uncertainty. It was not a natural phenomenon, but the tremors of a world on the brink of change. Whispers that had once been confined to hidden corners of the court now spread like wildfire, fueling the flames of discontent. The human's presence was no longer a secret, nor was it a distant threat. It had become the rallying cry of a new movement, one that believed the queen had grown weak, her judgment clouded by something as fragile and fleeting as human affection. The rebel factions, scattered throughout the distant moons and war-torn colonies, began to unite under the banner of purity. They called themselves the Children of the Stars, and their war cry reverberated across the galaxy like a drumbeat. No more weakness. No more mercy. On the fringes of the Empire, weapons were being readied, fleets were being assembled, and the Zarian military, once the unstoppable force that had crushed all who dared defy them, found itself divided. Those who still clung to the old ways saw the Queen's bond with the human as an unforgivable betrayal. As the rebellion swelled, the Queen stood at the edge of her throne room, her gaze fixed on the stars that had once been her empire's birthright. She could feel the pulse of revolution spreading, infecting her court, her people, her family. And in the darkened hallways of the palace, shadows gathered, not just from the rebels, but from those who had once sworn allegiance to her. It was no longer a question of if the empire would fall, it was only a matter of when. As the news of the uprising spread through the palace, the courtiers gathered in silent, tense anticipation. The weight of the queen's decisions had never been heavier, and now the very core of her reign was at risk. It was not just rebellion she faced, it was the shattering of the fragile alliances that held the empire together. Noble families, once bound by blood and power, now stood divided. Those who saw the queen's affection for the human as an unthinkable flaw gathered their forces, whispering in shadows. Others, more pragmatic, argued that she had shown wisdom in recognizing the potential of a species that could endure against all odds. The queen herself stood in the center of her council hall, eyes locked on the faces of her most trusted advisors. Behind them, the grand tapestries of Zaria's victories seemed to mock her, each thread woven with the blood of those who had ruled before her. "Your Majesty," one of the high generals spoke, his voice cold with the weight of loyalty and fear. "This human, this outsider, is a threat. He is the symbol of your weakness, the infection spreading through our blood. If you do not sever ties with him, you will lose the throne and everything we have fought for." The queen felt the heavy weight of their words, and yet deep within her, there was a quiet, defiant voice that whispered no. She had seen in the human a strength greater than any army, his love for his dying world, his fight for survival. It was not weakness. It was the heartbeat of a species that refused to bend to the cruelty of fate. But her court could not see that. They saw only treason. And now the question echoed through her mind. Was her love for the human the ultimate act of wisdom, or had it become the empire's undoing? The palace walls, once the unbreachable fortress of an empire, now trembled under the assault of the rebels. The sounds of war, sharp and chaotic, filled the air as battle cruisers descended from the heavens, their hulls ablaze with the fury of rebellion. The capital city, once a monument to Zaria's unparalleled power, now burned under the siege. It was not just the guns of war that threatened the queen's reign. It was the resolve of the rebels, led by former allies, by generals who had once pledged their lives to her, now turned against her. They believed her heart had been corrupted by love, by a weakness they could not afford to tolerate. Outside the palace, the rebel forces rallied, their voices rising in defiance. Within, the queen stood at the center of her control room, eyes steely and unwavering. The royal guard, few in number but fierce in loyalty, prepared to make their last stand. She could feel the tension building, the inevitability of the final confrontation closing in. The Green Fleet, a symbol of indomitable power, was being torn apart from within. It was a war of ideals, not just firepower. The rebels believed that purity could only be preserved by wiping out the influence of the human, by severing the ties that had so corrupted their queen's mind. They would see her fall, and yet, in the heart of the chaos, a single thought pushed through the rising storm. Could the humans stand with her against this tide? Or had their bond become the very thing that would destroy everything they had built? The last room of the palace stood in silence, the throne at its center like a dark altar of fate. The walls once adorned with the triumphs of the Zurian Empire now reflected only the fragility of a reign on the brink of collapse. The queen stood before the throne, her hand hovering over it, as if deciding whether to claim it one last time or walk away. Her empire was crumbling, her court was divided, her people were ready to rise against her. And yet the choice that lay before her was not one of political strategy. It was not a decision of tactics or war. It was a decision of the heart. To save her people, she would have to betray the human, to sever the bond that had grown between them. To protect the empire, she would have to cast aside everything she had come to know about love, trust, and sacrifice. And yet, if she chose the human, if she followed the path of her heart, the empire would be lost. The rebels would overwhelm them. The throne would fall, and the galaxy would be plunged into chaos. In that moment, she understood the true weight of her reign. It had never been about conquering worlds. It had always been about making impossible choices, between the self and the empire, between love and duty. With a single, decisive breath, she made her choice, and in doing so, she sealed the fate of her empire and the future of two worlds. In the coldest hours of the night, the queen stood at the edge of the royal courtyard, her heart pounding in her chest. The human was near, hidden in the shadows, his breath steady, his presence the one thing that had kept her grounded amidst the chaos. But now the weight of the empire's fate bore down on her, and the only way to save him was to destroy everything they had built together. "I have to do this," she whispered, the words foreign on her lips. Her gaze fell upon the distant horizon, the twin moons of Zerea casting their pale light upon the landscape, as though the stars themselves were watching. The rebellion had reached its peak. If the queen refused to act, her enemies would seize the throne. And the human, his mere existence, was the spark that could ignite the firestorm. His life, bound to hers, was now the weapon they would use against her. In the cruelest twist of fate, the only way to protect him was to betray him. She could not afford to be seen as weak. Not now. Not when so much was at stake. So, she made a choice. Stepping forward, she found him waiting, confusion in his eyes. She looked at him one last time, this human whose spirit had shown her the depths of her own soul. And with a trembling voice, she gave the command. "Leave. You have no place here anymore. Go back to where you came from." His eyes darkened, his heart breaking in real time, and her soul splintered in two. But it was for his own good. To protect him, she had to destroy him. As the queen's words hung in the air, thick with finality, the human's face twisted in disbelief. For a moment, there was silence. Only the harsh wind that cut through the royal courtyard filled the void between them. His eyes searched hers, looking for any trace of the connection they had shared, but there was none. You're sending me away?" His voice was raw, each word a stab that sent shockwaves through her chest. He had never sounded so small, so vulnerable. "I am the queen, I command it," she replied, her voice ice cold, though it cracked with the weight of her own agony. She had to be strong. She had to. The human stepped back, his body rigid with disbelief. "After everything we've been through, you're just going to toss me aside?" His fist clenched, the anger in his eyes rising like an unstoppable tide. "You're not the queen I thought you were. You're nothing but a coward." Her heart splintered with his words. She had become a stranger in his eyes. The woman who had shared her soul with him now stood before him like a ghost, someone entirely different. The pain was almost unbearable, yet it was the only way. The queen felt the weight of his betrayal crushing her chest. His words were a dagger to her heart, but she couldn't stop. He had to believe this lie, for his own safety, for the good of the empire. She wasn't just breaking his heart, she was shattering her own. With one final glance, he turned away, the silence between them louder than any scream. The queen stood there, her heart in pieces, as he disappeared into the shadows of the night. The human's exile began in silence. No guards accompanied him, no grand ceremony, no final salute. He was not a prisoner to be paraded. He was a casualty in a war he had never wanted. His punishment was not one of chains, but of solitude. the cruelest form of exile a person could endure. On a distant, barren world, far from the glowing spires of Ziria, beyond the reach of the Empire's advanced technology, he was left alone, cast out like an unwanted relic of a dying civilization. The world was harsh, unforgiving. Desolate winds swept across the barren landscapes, echoing the desolation within his soul. He stood at the edge of a crumbling cliff, staring out at the endless horizon, the once vibrant stars now distant and cold. He was alone in a universe that no longer seemed to care for him. All his life he had fought to survive. Against every odd, against every force that had ever sought to erase humanity, he had fought. But now, faced with an unthinkable betrayal, survival seemed a hollow victory. The Queen's face haunted him. Her words haunted him. He had trusted her. They had shared their worlds. Two souls, different yet the same. And she had discarded him. The stars, once a symbol of endless possibility, now seemed like the prison of his existence. He had nothing but the bitter taste of betrayal, the weight of a broken heart, and the endless silence of a world that offered no answers. He wasn't just exiled from her. He was exiled from everything he had believed in. Back on Zaria, in the heart of the Empire, the Queen sat upon the throne, a silent tear falling from her eyes as she stared at the vast emptiness of her court. The regal, commanding aura she had once worn with pride now felt like a cage, suffocating her from within. The cost of power was clear to her now. It had taken everything, and it would take even more before the end. She had given up so much for the Empire. She had sacrificed her heart, her future, and the only chance at true love she had ever known. But the throne required a price, and this was the cost. Loneliness. The courtiers no longer dared speak her name with respect. The once adoring nobles now eyed her with fear and suspicion. She was a queen who had betrayed her own heart to protect her people, and in doing so, she had become a ruler devoid of humanity. Every corner of the palace felt empty now, like a hollow shell. The corridors that had once felt alive with conversation and intrigue were now silent. Her people no longer celebrated her victories. They only whispered behind her back. She had isolated herself in the name of duty, but that duty had a price. She could still feel his presence in the back of her mind, a shadow of a love she had thrown away. The weight of his absence was a constant ache in her chest. His eyes, once full of wonder and defiance, now seemed a distant memory, a reminder of everything she had lost. The Queen's tears were not just for the love she had betrayed, but for the empire she had sacrificed it all for. In the end, the price of power had not been worth it. The human had no choice but to rise from the ashes of his exile. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and yet the bitter sting of betrayal never left him. On the barren planet, he had fought to survive, against nature, against himself, against the crushing weight of loneliness. But survival had become a hollow victory. There was nothing left for him here except emptiness. That was when the thought came to him, like a spark in the darkest night. He had nothing left to lose, but the universe still needed saving. The Queen had made her choice, betraying him to save her empire. But she had failed to see one thing: humanity could never be destroyed by betrayal. Humanity was resilient, it adapted, it rose. And now he would rise too. His first step was survival, but his second step was rebellion. He knew the universe far too well to believe he was the only one who had suffered at the hands of the alien empire. He wasn't alone. There were others, outcasts, rebels, those who had been wronged by the Zurians, by the Queen herself. They were scattered across the galaxy, living in the shadows, just waiting for someone to give them a reason to fight. That someone was him, with nothing but his wits, his will, and the human ingenuity that had saved his kind for millennia. The humans set out to gather allies. He would return to the heart of the empire, and he would make them pay for what they had done. But he would need more than just rage. He would need an army. The call to arms was not answered by soldiers or nobles. It was answered by those forgotten by the galaxy, by the outcasts. They were the ones the empire had cast aside, the ones the Zurians deemed insignificant. They were the criminals, the rebels, the exiles, the ones who had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. At first, the human doubted they would heed his call. Who was he to lead them? A mere human, an outcast like themselves. But he had learned one thing in his time on that forsaken world. When the powerful are threatened, the powerless rise. The first to come was an alien known as Korath, a former Zyrian military officer who had been exiled for speaking out against the Empire's corruption. Korath's loyalty had been broken long ago, and now he was a wandering ghost of his former self. But when the human offered him a cause, a reason to fight again, Korath's heart reignited. He was not alone anymore. Next was Laysara, a former diplomat from a neutral world destroyed by the Empire's greed. Her people had been erased from the star maps, their cities turned to ash, their history wiped clean. She knew the galaxy would never be the same without the power of the Zyrian Empire. But she also knew that the price of peace had been too high. She joined without hesitation. Soon more came. Outlaws, exiles, even the displaced, each with their own grudge against the Empire. They were a ragtag group, united by a single burning desire, to topple the Empire that had wronged them all. And at the heart of them stood the human, a symbol of defiance, a beacon of hope for those who had nothing left to lose. As his army of outcasts grew, so too did the human's resolve. His rage, once consumed by heartbreak and betrayal, was now a fiery weapon. The Queen's enemies had underestimated humanity, thinking them fragile and weak. But they were wrong. The human knew that power wasn't just in strength or numbers. It was in purpose. He had that purpose now. With every passing day, he learned more about the internal struggles within the Zyrian Empire. Factions fighting for control, ancient rivalries that stretched back millennia. The Queen's rule was not as secure as it seemed. Her political enemies, long hidden in the shadows, were eager to exploit any weakness. And the human had learned to use that to his advantage. He began to strike at the heart of the Empire, not with brute force, but with cunning. He stirred unrest among the Zyrian nobles, turning them against each other. It wasn't enough to simply fight the Empire. He had to weaken it from the inside. The human didn't care about power. He didn't care about the throne. What he cared about was righting the wrongs of the past, for himself and for everyone who had suffered under the Zyrian regime. Every battle was personal now. Every victory was a step toward justice. And every time one of the Queen's enemies fell, the human felt a surge of righteous fury. He would show them all what humanity was capable of, not as slaves, not as pawns, but as a force to be reckoned with. And when the Queen finally learned of his rebellion, she would understand the mistake she had made. He was no longer her prisoner. He was her reckoning. It wasn't just a rescue. It wasn't just an army marching toward the throne. It was the culmination of everything the human had fought for. The reclaiming of his dignity, the restoration of his love, and the beginning of a war that would echo across the stars. The Queen had once ruled her empire with an iron grip, but now it was crumbling, piece by piece. The human, leading a force of rebels and outcasts, had returned, not as a prisoner, but as a liberator. The assault on the palace was swift and brutal. The human had no illusions about the difficulty of what he was attempting. But he had learned to fight with a purpose, and every move he made was calculated to break the Zyrians' hold on the galaxy. The throne room, the heart of the Empire, was a place of power, but also a place of vulnerability. It was the perfect battleground. The Queen's enemies had gathered, their forces prepared to strike at the human's heart, but they hadn't anticipated him leading an army of their own kind. He was no longer the isolated human they thought him to be. In a flash of blinding light, the human and his army broke through the gates. The throne room, once a symbol of the Queen's absolute rule, now became a battlefield. The Queen's gaze locked onto his, a mixture of disbelief, admiration, and regret passing between them. She had failed him. She had failed them all. And yet, in this moment, they would be together again. The rescue had shaken 1,000 worlds, not just because it was a victory, but because it was proof that humanity could rise, even from the deepest pits of despair. The Queen's empire was no longer invincible. And the human? He was no longer a prisoner. He was a force to be reckoned with. The palace trembled under the weight of the coming storm. Across the vast crystalline halls, the hum of energy weapons and the clash of alien technology reverberated through the air. The human, now a leader of rebels, stood on the threshold of the throne room, the heat of the battle radiating from every corner. His heart thundered, not just from the fight, but from the weight of what was at stake. He had not come to this moment to conquer an empire. He had come to reclaim a future with the Queen. They had fought the galaxy together, their bond transcending species, worlds, and everything that should have divided them. But now, standing in the midst of the battle, their love felt both like the greatest strength and the most dangerous weakness. Blades of light sliced through the air, searing beams of energy dancing between rebel and royal forces. The human's hand tightened around his weapon, the pulse of adrenaline fueling his every movement. He fought with the fury of someone who had lost everything, but had everything to gain in this moment. Above him, the Queen stood on the balcony of her crystal throne, her gaze fixed on the chaos below. She had never imagined that love could be both her salvation and her undoing. But she had learned that love, this human's love, was more powerful than anything the galaxy could throw at them. As the battle raged around him, the human's gaze locked onto hers. In that instant, their worlds collided and a promise passed between them. Win or lose, they would face this fight together. The throne room, once a symbol of unyielding power, was now a battlefield soaked in the blood of both friends and foes. The clash of metal against alien armor rang out, accompanied by the sickening thud of bodies hitting the ground. Both sides were relentless, their motives driven by years of bitterness and betrayal. But for the human, it was personal. Every blow struck against an enemy felt like a step closer to the throne, and yet every death felt like a weight around his soul. Among the fallen were faces he had once known as allies, his rebel brothers, the ones who had joined him in this crusade against the Empire. But they were not the only casualties. The Queen's own forces, once loyal to her, now fought against her in each other, driven by the greed and power that had always lurked beneath the surface of her rule. The noble houses had turned on each other, as predicted, and the Zerian elite were scattered, their ranks in disarray. But the Queen's enemies were not the only ones to bleed. The human had come to realize something he hadn't expected. The war they fought was not just one of conquest, but one of lost dreams. Dreams of a better empire, a better future. Dreams of a love they had fought for in secret, now shattered beneath the weight of their choices. For a moment, the human's heart broke. He thought of the time they had shared, the quiet conversations, the fleeting moments of tenderness. The price of this battle was too great, but there was no turning back. There would be no easy path to peace, no safe resolution. Their love had led them here, and in this moment, it felt like it was what would either save or destroy them both. The human had always known that this battle was never about power. It wasn't about the throne. It wasn't about the empires or the grandiose dreams of the alien races who fought for control of the galaxy. It was about humanity's ability to endure, to survive, to challenge the heavens themselves when faced with the impossible. The Zerian Empire, with its advanced technology and near-invincible might, had seemed unstoppable. But the human had learned that strength wasn't just in technology or firepower. It was in the heart. It was in the willingness to sacrifice everything for those you loved. And so, the human fought. Each blow he struck, each move he made, carried the weight of all those who had suffered beneath the Empire's rule. He had once been a prisoner. He had once been a pawn. But now he was more than that. He was the embodiment of human defiance, his fists clenched not in rage but in purpose. It was then that he saw the Queen, her eyes wide, her body swaying with the power of her own inner conflict. She had been forced to choose, just as he had. The love they shared was a threat to the very order of the galaxy. But it was also the only thing that made sense in a universe that had always tried to break them. As the rebels pressed forward, the human's thoughts were clear. He didn't want the throne. He didn't want to rule. He only wanted to fight for a future where he and the Queen could live, not as enemies or conquerors, but as equals. But he couldn't fight alone. The final blow had to come from both of them. The Queen stood before her throne, no longer the cold, distant ruler of an empire, but a woman who had sacrificed everything for the sake of love. Her heart, once ruled by duty and power, had become a battleground of its own. She knew the cost of the choices they had made, but she also knew this. The love she shared with the human was not just a rebellion against her enemies, but against the very system that had kept her imprisoned for so long. Her hands trembled as she held the scepter of her empire, the symbol of her birthright, now a weight she could no longer bear. Behind her, the sounds of battle continued, but in that moment, the only battle that mattered was the one raging within her. She could feel the human's presence, even across the chaos, and it gave her the strength to make her final stand. With a decisive motion, the queen cast aside the symbol of her power, letting it crash to the ground with a sound that echoed through the halls. She had made her choice. She would not let the empire dictate her fate, nor would she let her love be the cause of their destruction. Together, the queen and the human made their stand, not as conquerors, but as revolutionaries. The true battle had never been about the throne. It had always been about love, and love, as they both now understood, was the ultimate revolution. With one final charge, they faced the forces that had once been their enemies, united in a common cause. The battle for the galaxy was over, but the fight for their future was only just beginning. The ruins of the Zurian palace stood in stark contrast to the peaceful silence that had settled over the galaxy in the wake of the final battle. Once a place of unyielding power, the throne room was now a hollow monument to what had been. The crystalline halls, where whispers of politics and empire had once echoed, now lay abandoned, filled with the ghosts of a regime that had crumbled beneath the weight of its own ambition. The queen, now without her crown, stood at the precipice of the empire she had once ruled. Her fingers brushed the cold, shattered remnants of her throne, fragments of the symbols that had once defined her existence. It was no longer a place of power, but a place of memories. Memories of a time when she believed duty and tradition were the only forces that could shape the future. Now those same forces had betrayed her. The only thing that had proven true, the only thing worth living for, was the love she shared with the human by her side. Beside her, the human stood, his eyes gazing out into the horizon of the ruined capital, a city that would never be the same again. He had never wanted this, never wanted to be a conqueror or a ruler. But standing there, watching the remnants of the empire burn, he realized something. They had never been the architects of this destruction. The empire had built its own demise, and they had merely been caught in its wake. They hadn't destroyed it. They had liberated it. The weight of a crown was heavy, but the weight of love was heavier still. And as they turned their backs on the crumbling empire, they knew that the future they had fought for was not one of power or conquest, but one of freedom and possibility. For the first time in years, the queen felt the full weight of relief, the weight of expectation, of ruling over an empire built on the suffering of others, had been lifted. In its place was a new purpose, one she hadn't fully understood until this moment. They left the ruins of the Zurian throne behind, the final remnants of their past dissipating into the stars like dust carried on a cosmic wind. The ship they boarded was nothing grand, nothing like the royal vessels she had once known. But to the queen and the human, it was the embodiment of a new life, one free from the demands of an empire, free from the expectations of a throne, free from everything that had once defined them. As the ship soared into the dark expanse of space, the starlight streaming through the windows reflected the hope that now filled their hearts. The human stood beside the queen at the helm, his hand gently resting against the control panel. There were no words for what they had shared, no need to explain the depth of their bond. They understood each other in a way that transcended language or custom. The vastness of space stretched before them, a canvas of infinite possibilities. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. For the first time in their lives, they were free to make their own choices, to carve out their own destiny without the chains of royalty, rebellion, or empire pulling them in different directions. The queen, no longer a ruler, no longer bound by the weight of crowns or thrones, felt the exhilaration of liberation. She was a woman, no longer a symbol, no longer a figurehead. Her heart, once heavy with duty, was light now. She turned to the human, their eyes meeting, and in that gaze she found everything she had once thought impossible. They had defied the galaxy, they had defied an empire, and they had survived, together. The human smiled, a small, quiet expression of peace and fulfillment. There was no need for words, no need to say what they both already knew. The galaxy was vast, and their place in it was undefined. For once, there were no expectations, no responsibilities, only the freedom to be who they were, to live as they chose. Their new world was waiting for them. It was one of their own making, far from the ashes of the Syrian Empire, far from the pain and power struggles that had defined their lives until now. The future, like the stars themselves, stretched out before them, endless, beautiful, and full of promise. As the ship glided silently through the cosmos, the Queen and the humans set course for a new beginning. Together, they would explore the wild stars and build a life that would forever remain untouched by the empire they had left behind. The ruins of the Zurian palace had long faded from their view, replaced by the endless void of space, but the memories of the place lingered in their hearts. They had left behind a world of power and strife, a galaxy that had been built on the backs of countless lives, all to sustain an empire that had failed them both. Yet standing together now in the quiet of their new ship, far away from the remnants of the throne, there was only one thing that mattered: each other. The stars above them glittered like the very dreams they had once thought impossible. And here in this moment, under the endless expanse of the cosmos, the human and the Queen stood side by side. The human's hand reached out, gently brushing a strand of her dark hair from her face. His touch, soft and tender, was the final thread that connected them both to the reality they had created. The Queen turned to him, her eyes full of both longing and peace, a mixture of emotions that had been building within her for so long. She had never imagined this kind of freedom, never thought that she would find someone who saw her not as a monarch or a symbol, but as a woman. And yet, here they were, two beings from different worlds, now bound by something stronger than fate. Without a word, the human leaned in. Her breath caught in her throat as his lips met hers, and for a moment, everything else in the universe fell away. There was no war, no throne, no rebellion, only the warmth of his kiss, a symbol of all they had overcome. In that kiss, there was no longer a need for words, no need for explanation. There was only the shared promise of a future they would create together. The galaxy around them seemed to pause, as though recognizing the profound weight of what they had accomplished and the purity of the bond that had come to define them. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a vow, unspoken but understood. They would not be defined by the ruins of their past. They would build something new, something entirely their own. No matter where the stars took them, they would never be alone again. As the kiss ended, they pulled away, their foreheads resting against each other in a quiet, intimate silence. The hum of the ship's engines was the only sound in the background, a comforting rhythm that marked the steady forward motion of their journey. The human could feel the warmth of her skin against his, the pulse of her heart beating in time with his own. There was a connection between them that no power in the galaxy could sever. Nothing could destroy what they had forged. The Queen's eyes opened first, her gaze finding the endless stars outside the viewport. She had never known peace like this, never known that her heart could feel this light. For so long, she had been weighed down by duty, by expectation, by the belief that she was meant to rule an empire. But now, as she stood in the quiet of the cosmos with the human beside her, she realized that her true destiny was not written in the stars of a dying empire, but in the shared dream of a new beginning. The human, standing beside her, looked out into the endless vastness of space. It was a future without the chains of the past, a future where they could write their own story. They would explore new worlds, discover new possibilities, and build something that neither of them had ever imagined. A life defined not by power, but by love, freedom, and choice. "I never thought we'd get here," the human said softly, breaking the silence. The Queen smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "Neither did I, but here we are, together." The words carried the weight of everything they had overcome, the trials, the betrayals, the enemies they had faced. And yet, in this moment, there was only possibility. The human took her hand in his, their fingers intertwining as they shared a gaze that held all their hopes for the future. And in the vast silence of space, As the stars glimmered far beyond their reach, they made a silent promise to each other. No matter where their journey took them, they would always be dreamers together, side by side, exploring the universe and building a life that was as boundless as the cosmos itself. This was not just a love story, it was a new beginning, a future written in stardust, where the only limits were the ones they chose to set for themselves. Together they would face whatever came, for there was no obstacle too great, no galaxy too far. In the quiet of the cosmos, surrounded by infinite possibilities, the Queen and the human knew one thing for certain. They had finally found home, and it was wherever they were together.